So we'll hear from Dr. Dennis Ndolo, who will speak on the principles and applications of the good regulatory practices. So Dr. Ndolo is the group leader for biopesticide at the International Center for Genetic Engineering and Biotechnology in South Africa. With a PhD in entomology from the University of Nairobi, he has a background in crop protection and over a decade of experience in agricultural research. Dr. Ndolo, please go ahead with your presentation.
This is Janie Dubois. You all know me. It's my pleasure to welcome the technical working group members to this webinar. Today, we're speaking with Mr. Dennis Ndolo, and you just heard his bio. And we're hearing specifically about some work they did, including which started with the stock take, which is something we have talked about in the technical working groups for Nigeria. But they did that, the stock take and the evaluation for a project on harmonization of biopesticides regulations in Southern Africa. So multiple countries together trying to align their biopesticide regulations to facilitate trade. So this presentation will be delivered in an interview format, and it will be my pleasure to be your host. So I will be interviewing Dr. Ndolo. So Dr. Ndolo, thank you very much for accepting our invitation to share your experience with the members of the technical working groups on food safety in Nigeria.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to this webinar. It's actually my great pleasure to share with you insights, from a project that I led, a project that was funded by the Standards and Trade Development Facility that focused on developing and harmonizing guidelines for the registration of biopesticides and biological control agents in Southern Africa. It was a unique challenge, combining the science of pest control with the art of regulation, but it was something that was both rewarding and, dare I say, occasionally entertaining. So thank you very much.
Thank you. So I'll move on with my first question.
Yes.
Could you describe the primary trade challenge related to pesticide MRLs that prompted the initiative to regulate biopesticides in Southern Africa?
So thank you, Jen. So the primary problem we were facing involved difficulties with trade from the SADC region. So the SADC region, that is the Southern African Development Community. It's a community that consists of 16 member states. So some countries in the region were experiencing limited export market access, limited access to export markets, because they were unable to comply with residue standards, what is commonly called maximum residue levels in export markets. And the main reason for this non-compliance was heavy reliance on synthetic chemical pesticides, for crop protection, especially for late season pests. Synthetic pesticides, when they're used, especially towards harvest, those are the ones that can cause residue challenges. So what the rationale behind the project was that if the synthetic pesticides applications at the end of the season, the ones that are used towards harvest, can be replaced with biopesticides, non-residue generating biopesticides, then there was then the potential to reduce the residue problems. So in other words, what we were looking at was just using pesticides the way they would be used early in the season, but replacing the last applications with biopesticides. And so that would ensure that the pesticide has got time to break down, but the biopesticide continues providing pest control until harvest. But then to be able to use biopesticides this way, they have to be registered. They have to be registered and they have to be available to growers. However, many countries in the SADC region lacked biopesticide regulations. And without biopesticide regulations, these products cannot be registered, they cannot be regulated, and they cannot be available for use by growers. So what we then did was this was to look at the situation regarding biopesticide registration in the SADC region. We began by working with a select number of countries just to try and understand the regulatory landscape, with a view to then designing appropriate interventions to improve the landscape to ensure that more of these products could be registered and available to farmers. The idea actually was to see if, after understanding the biopesticide regulatory landscape, we could develop common biopesticide regulatory standards that would make it easier for these products, or products, say, registered in one jurisdiction, to be registered in another jurisdiction, so that you have more of these products getting to growers. And with more of these products getting growers, they would then be able to use them for, amongst other things, mitigating pesticide residues.
Wonderful. I'll ask you my next question, which is, why did you make a point of doing this work while following guidelines for GRPs, or good regulatory practices?
It's not easy to be introspective about our own regulations. And it's even more difficult when you try to evaluate the regulations and policies in different countries to agree on solutions that will fix the problem that we have at hand without creating new ones. So that was the big premise on which we started from. It's not easy to be introspective, and when you try to just do it, on your own, it may be a bit of a challenge. So the reason why we then relied on follow the guidelines of good regulatory practices is because good regulatory practices, or GRPs, these are internationally recognized processes, systems, tools, and methods, which can improve the quality of regulatory measures and ensure that the outcomes are not only effective, but also transparent, inclusive, and sustained. So GRPs can play a big role in improving processes associated with the design, development, and review of SPS or regulatory measures, and they come with various benefits. So, for example, one of the benefits of using GRPs is that they ensure that the adopted measures, whatever you develop, whatever measures you develop and adopt, are able to achieve the intended policy objectives without creating unnecessary barriers to trade. Because sometimes we can adopt certain measures which may achieve certain objectives, but still, create barriers to trade. So GRPs ensure that the objectives can be achieved without creating unnecessary barriers to trade. That is one. GRPs also generally support better policy making because they allow for various factors to be appropriately considered when SPS measures are developed and implemented, or when regulatory measures are developed and implemented. So various factors can be considered, and these factors would include trade factors, economic factors, health factors, as well as environmental, social, and gender issues. GRPs also really help to ensure that there's alignment with international standards, because that's also important. So they ensure there's international alignment with international standards for food safety and animal and plant health. Now, fortunately, when we were implementing this project, the Standards and Trade Development Facility had developed a great GRP guide. The GRP guide that was developed by the Standards and Trade Development Facility was meant to address GRPs in the SPS content, and it was mainly targeted at country-level SPS regulators in developed countries. So it really provided us with a good opportunity to work with with STDF, who also actually test the guide, and was a very useful tool. I mean, it was a very useful tool during the time when we were implementing this project.
Excellent. And you can see, for everyone, you can see the picture here on the slide on the bottom right. That is the tool, the SPS guidelines that was developed by the Standards and Trade Facility, STDF.
Yes, it was a very useful tool. Sorry, Jen. Yeah, because as you all know, you can never have too much help when it comes to such projects that can have a really huge impact on regional trade. So the SPS guide came in very handy for this project. Thank you.
Wonderful. My next question is, getting a little more focused on which good regulatory practices you used, and the main one was stock taking, the need to understand what's already in the books. But you also incorporated more. Can you please tell us more about these GRPs that were integrated and how they were integrated in your project approach?
So, so thank you very much. So as you rightly said, the main GRP was stock taking, and that's because we really needed to understand or to know what the regulations were in each country to get a lay of the land, so to speak, before we could propose any kind of harmonization. So stock taking was the main GRP. There are different ways in which stock taking can be done, but for us, our project coincided with the COVID pandemic. So when COVID struck, we had to really go back to the drawing board and find out what was the best way of carrying out stock taking. So what we did is that we began with a very thorough desk review, because at the time we could not be able to travel. So we started with a desk review, but that was actually not really enough. Even though there was COVID, it was necessary to do more than just a desk review. Because even for the consultants, it was clearly not enough for them just to do desk review for purposes of getting the information that we needed. But we also needed to understand the reality, not just the theoretical aspects. So in addition to stock taking, where we mainly did through a desk review, we also then had to bring in a few more GRPs, so stakeholder engagement, coordination, and collaboration. Because through a desk review, you mainly get more of the theory, but we needed to also focus on realities on the ground. So for purposes of that, we then had to rely on a few other GRPs. That's, as I said, stakeholder engagement, coordination, and collaboration. And finally, of course, monitoring and evaluation. So we made efforts. For example, in stakeholder engagement, we made an effort during the COVID pandemic to at least travel and meet a few stakeholders, despite the fact that there were lots of restrictions. But that was we consider that very necessary to do. But I'd last like to say a few words about monitoring and evaluation. Monitoring and evaluation is normally key for any project, so it was integrated throughout the project. But for us, we also tied that with what we considered outcome evaluation. So that is determining whether the SPS measures that we were proposing would achieve the intended impacts. So in our context, what that meant was evaluating the potential of these measures to actually facilitate trade. So to cut a long story short, it's basically stock taking, stakeholder engagement, coordination and collaboration, as well as monitoring and evaluation.
Very good. So in this project, sorry, you needed to introduce consultants and ask government officials to open up to them about their regulations, which is straightforward because it's written down, but You also needed them to provide information on how the agencies, the departments, and the inspectors were actually, as you said, not just the theory, but also the practice on how they were implementing these regulations. So we know that this information is always a little bit harder to get. How did you manage to convince everyone involved that it was to their benefit to fully participate?
Thank you very much. So, so let me start by saying that we had to adapt our approach, especially because of the pandemic. I think it might have been easier if our consultants could have just visited each competent authority and had long conversations there, but that could not happen. So, to get to your question, how did we then do it? To get everyone involved and to participate fully. So first of all, I'd like to mention that the project lead was my organization. So my organization is the International Center for Genetic Engineering and Biotechnology. And we worked very closely with the Regional Association of Pesticide Regulators. So that's what we call the Southern African Pesticide Regulators Forum and other relevant entities in Southern Africa. So what this actually means is really that when we proposed this project, we proposed to be introspective altogether, right from the very start. So this was actually a very good place to start. But I'd also like to add that ICGEB, that's the acronym for my organization, is an intergovernmental organization with operations aligned to those of the United Nations Common System. So we are a center of excellence for research. We provide training and technology transfer to industry in order to promote sustainable global development. We have 69 member countries around the world, including about 6 in Southern Africa. So we have Angola, we have Mauritius, Namibia, South Africa, Tanzania, and Zimbabwe. So we obviously had a strong reputation and trusted relationships with government officials working in various fields, including regulations and crop protection. So in this project, as I said, we actually started with a desk review, then we had surveys to complement the information that was publicly available. And as I did mention earlier, that we also did try to get some meetings, even though it was difficult, we managed to get some meetings in Botswana. And that was especially because that's also where the offices of the SADC, that's the regional body, that's where their offices are located. So we made every effort, despite the challenges that were there, to at least make a visit to the SADC secretariats in Botswana. Jen, I hope that does justice to your question.
Yes, thank you. Obviously, being the right organization was key. Being an organization that people trusted and were used already to opening up to. So that was very good. Thank you. And my next question is, how did you dig into the regulations and the implementation to understand what was causing that trade barrier?
It was not easy because, as you can imagine, it's not just one thing, you know, one gap or one difference. So it's not very easy to dig into the regulations and to understand actually what's causing the barrier, because, you know, as I said, it may not just be one or two things. So what we had to do was we first had to determine the general scope of pesticide regulations in each country. What I mentioned earlier as the lay of the land, so to speak. So we had to determine what was the general scope of the pesticide regulatory landscape in each country. So for example, we asked questions like, was there a way to register pesticides? You know, did their pesticide regulatory frameworks make provisions for pesticides. So if there was a way, for instance, then we dug into the data that was needed, and if there were rules about how and where this data could be generated. So it is things like this that we looked at. So we looked at things also like the fees charged for registration, because we know that to have having regional facilitation mechanisms may affect these fees, and that these fees may be essential for the operation of the registration authorities. Now, we really needed to determine for each country also the factors that would facilitate regional harmonization of registration for biopesticides. What are the factors that would facilitate it, and what are the factors that could hinder it? Yeah. So, for example, we asked questions like, were there steps that needed to be taken at the national level to enable biopesticide registration or to accept registration from other countries? So I think, to cut a long story short, it was very necessary to get an overall picture of the biopesticide regulatory landscape in each country in order to understand what was causing the trade barriers.
Thank you very much. And of course, the big question that always comes after a nice explanation like this of how you did this, how long did it take to do all this stock taking?
So it was quite something. So we started in June of 2021. So we started in June of 2021 when we did a desk review. Then, of course, I mentioned the surveys that we did. I mentioned the meetings that we had. We had virtual meetings, but we also had a meeting in Botswana. And then we followed this up with, of course, interpreting the data that we had collected and drafting of a report. In fact, a copy of the report is available online. If there's any interest, we have a copy of that report. And maybe, if you allow me, I'll just quickly go through some of the key aspects of the report. We actually released the report must have been May of 2022. And it included a few key aspects. So, for example, one of the important things that we reported on was, one, what were the key considerations to be taken into account in the development of the harmonized guidelines? What are the key things that needs to be taken into account? Because this is an exercise that we were carrying out in order to develop these guidelines. So that's one of the things that we reported on. We also, in that report, looked at what were the requirements to ensure that once these guidelines are developed, countries are able to make use of their provisions. So what are the requirements which were required to sort of domesticate those guidelines? What interventions are necessary at country level? Because developing regional guidelines is just one part of the story. Ensuring that each individual country is able to make use of provisions of those guidelines is another step. So, at the risk of sounding like a broken record, the first thing was, what do we need to take into account? Once these guidelines are developed, how do countries then incorporate provisions or utilize the provisions of these guidelines? So those may include regulatory changes within the country. There are certain legal steps that needed to be taken into the country. So for us, that was very important. It was important not only to figure out how to develop the guidelines, but it was also very important to figure out, once those guidelines have been developed, what then happens at country level, so that it was therefore a very sort of forward-looking stocktake, so to speak.
Excellent. So this was obviously an enormous piece of work, very large endeavor. What came out of all of this work for you?
Yes. As you mentioned, yeah, it's rightly mentioned, this was a very large endeavor. But I will quickly run through some of the key outcomes. So one of the key outcomes is that the stock taking illuminated a very sort of clear path forward for the project countries. And it showed both the need and the urgent need and the potential, the exciting potential for a regionally harmonized approach to biopesticide regulation. It showed there was very strong consensus that shared guidelines would make a significant difference. They would significantly reduce duplicative efforts. They would lower costs for manufacturers, because also you may understand that many manufacturers for biopesticides, for example, are primarily small, smaller companies. So having these regional guidelines would also greatly lower costs of for manufacturers. And most importantly, they would also accelerate the availability of these solutions to farmers. But I'd like to hasten to add that the regional framework that was proposed under this project was not envisioned as a rigid imposition, but it was a flexible yet robust scaffold, adaptable to national contexts. So that flexibility was also important. You did say it was a large endeavor. So a few more things that one other important thing that we noted was that the countries were at very different levels in terms of regulatory maturity. So while some countries had very well-defined provisions for regulation of biopesticides and biological control agents, others had just more general pesticide laws, where biopesticides were regulated within the existing pesticide laws, which actually does not adequately address the unique characteristics of biological products. So it was therefore quite a large patchwork of varying requirements or varying regulatory maturity, so to speak, between the different countries. And you found that this brought about many challenges. So, for example, you had cases where there were very prolonged review timelines, inconsistent decision-making, and so on and so forth. If you would allow me, I just want to quickly go through some of the recommendations that came out of this stock take in terms of regulatory harmonization. One was to establish a common regional dossier format and data requirements for biopesticide registration. So a common format. And even for this common format, it was important to emphasize that it had to draw upon international best practices, but still remaining relevant to the regional context. So that common data requirements across the region was one of the key recommendations. Another key recommendation was developing a system for mutual recognition. So, for example, if you have biopesticides which have been registered in certain jurisdictions, is there a way in which there can be mutual recognition mechanisms that would facilitate some of the information that was used for registering those products, or even those products themselves, to then be registered in other jurisdictions? So there was also the suggestion to have mutual recognition mechanisms, which have the benefits of amongst other things, allowing countries to leverage each other's resources, and just enhances the efficiencies of regulatory decision making. I did indicate that one of the things that came out of the stock taking was that there were several countries that are still relying on systems that were designed for pesticides to regulate biopesticides. And that does not always work, because the characteristics of biopesticides and those of pesticides, they're very, very different. So one of the other recommendations was to implement methods which were tailored to the specific characteristics of biopesticides, so that when biopesticides are being registered, we are asking questions which are relevant to biopesticides. And so that ensures that we're just doing the evaluations for a registration in a more scientifically sound and contextually relevant manner. We also proposed the creation of a shared regional database of registered biopesticides. This facilitates information exchange, it enhances transparency, it supports decision making, so that regulators in the region can be able to know what products have already been registered in other jurisdictions. One of the things that the stocktake recommendations encourages is also information sharing, so that regulators can share information with one another. So if a product has been registered in one jurisdiction, it is then possible for regulators in just jurisdiction to share any relevant information with regulators in other jurisdictions if and when they need it. So that was also another recommendation that was made. One other thing that was clear during this exercise was the need for capacity building, because most regulators have been trained to regulate synthetic chemical pesticides. So there's still quite a bit of a depth of expertise, that is focused on the regulation of biopesticides. So one of the other recommendations was to give a significant push to capacity building, so that regulators can be trained not only on regulation of biopesticides, but also to ensure that the harmonized guidelines that will be developed from this process, there could be consistent application of those guidelines, because you want to be sure that the provisions of guidelines, if they are harmonized, then they are implemented consistently across the region. If we have a bit of time, and if you allow me, Jane, there are a few other things I consider key that we identified, including, for example, because as I said, developing the regional guidelines was one bit, but it was also very important to make recommendations on, once you have the regional guidelines, what then do you do at national level? So the ones I talked about, the points I've just listed now, relate mainly to the regional guidelines. For example, the mutual recognition, common dossier format. So that's at a regional level. But what then happens at country level? So we also made certain recommendations relevant for country level, to ensure that, as I said, the countries are able to eventually incorporate provisions of those guidelines into the way that they operate. So I can quickly run through a few of the suggestions that we made. So, for example,
one, because I'm sorry, as you're talking about the implementation of regional into domestic markets, yes. And for our technical working groups that we have now, it's equivalent, just at the smaller scale, which is taking something that is what the recommendations will be on, implementing something nationally, but then how do you work it into each of the competent authorities' systems? So this is so well aligned with what we are doing with these technical working groups. Please go ahead and give us more information.
Okay, let me see how much information I can give. So once the guidelines have been developed, actually one of the things that we also incorporated into the project was what we called, they were in-country workshops, yeah? And these were actually meant to go to give a deep dive into what happens at country level with regard to the guidelines. So anyway, as part of the stock take, we suggested a few things. One, formal adoption of the regional guidelines by the relevant regulatory authorities in each country. Now, that was important, but that was one of the things that we did is that we started engaging the regulators from the word go. So they were part of the project from the word go. So adopting the regional guidelines in their regulatory agencies then became a lot more seamless because they had been part of this process. So one of the things that we suggested is that once the regional guidelines have been developed, then they should actually be formally adopted by the relevant national regulatory authorities in each country. Number two, it is necessary, like the harmonization we were envisaging in South Africa was that each country would then revise their national processes to mirror the regional documents. So one of the things that we then also suggested is that it was then necessary, once the relevant national agencies had adopted the regional guidelines, was to revise the technical guidelines, the SOPs and internal manuals and so on and so forth, in order to align them to the national standards. To the regional standards. Another point was establishment of national biopesticide technical committees or expert panels with a mandate to implement and oversee the implementation of these guidelines. So that was also a recommendation that we made. And another recommendation was communication. So development of clear communication strategies to inform stakeholders, including industry, including researchers, including extension services, about the new processes. So these are recommendations that were made. And at national level, it actually is even a lot more detailed, because sometimes it's also necessary to identify other additional aspects would include which are the legal instruments that may need to be reviewed. Can they amend existing laws? Do they create new regulations? And so on and so forth. So those are other considerations that we say that it's also important to look at which are the appropriate legal instruments that need to be reviewed, and other things such as drafting of text, the relevant text, to align the national requirements to the harmonized regional guidelines. One thing that was important, an important suggestion that we made, is that it was very important to also look at the existing national laws to ensure that there is coherence and there are no contradictions. Because you're coming in with a document that has been developed at a regional level. Each country already has got various national laws, So it was also important to ensure that once these guidelines, if they're to be implemented at national level, it's important to carefully look at the existing national laws and ensure that there's coherence, with there are no contradictions with what's proposed in the national guidelines. We believed that consultation was very important. So throughout the process, it's even at national level, it's very important to consult with the relevant national entities. It's also very important to establish clear timelines for implementation of these guidelines. And it's also important that any documents that are then developed at a national level are, submitted. There are clear timelines to show how this will be submitted through the required legal steps until they're ultimately promulgated at national level. So to cut a long story short, essentially what we had in mind was that we have this regional document which comes up with certain provisions, but then countries would then have to now try and see how do they incorporate these provisions into their national regulatory processes. So in the interest of time, I may not have been able to go through it in a lot of detail, but we spent a lot of time at looking at what needs to happen at country level, and it's described in quite significant detail in the report of this stock taking that we did.
And I will share this report with everyone in the call. One final question. Any recommendations after you've gone through this giant process? Are there any recommendations you would have to others looking to apply good regulatory practices, GRPs, and the guidance in the STDF guide to evaluate and propose SPS measures?
Thank you very much. So I think one thing that I would really recommend, or I think I'll approach this from the angle of how the GRP guide was useful for us. So my overarching recommendation is the value of using, the good regulatory practice guide, especially the one that was developed by the STDF. And I'll quickly run through some of the ways in which I believe it was helpful. So the GRP guide, using the GRP guide, ensures that the guidelines we believe that were developed were transparent and predictable. So it ensures that you develop measures which are clear, which can lead to evidence-based decision-making, reducing arbitrary or fake processes. One of the challenges, in my view, and in my experience with developing regulations, is that it is always very easy to ask registrants, people who want to register products. It's always very easy to ask the good to know questions, questions that are asked without a deep thought into why that information is necessary for the regulator to be able to make a decision. But using the GRP guide was very useful in terms of ensuring that whatever regulations are made, are based on evidence, as I said, and it also eliminates the need to ask for unnecessary information. In fact, a good example, one time when we were doing this exercise, is we were reviewing some application forms, and you find that there are questions which are included therein, but it is not clear how that information will help in making a regulatory decision. So those are the ways in which I think efficiency is reduced. So for example, if you see an application asking for information on the length of the leg of an athlete, maybe there's reason why that information is needed, but it should be clear why that information is useful. So using the GRP guide ensures that we stick to information that is relevant for purposes of decision making. It makes it easier for the registrant, it makes it easier for the decision maker. So on this point, what I just want to underline again is one of the things that we noted that as a result of using the GRP guidance document, we really place a lot of on giving a lot of thought to why information is sought from a person, say, who wants to register a product, because only by doing that do you ensure that you only ask for information that would be useful. So another thing is that using the GRP guides also ensures that national regulations can be aligned to international standards. So that is another reason. And then it also helps to ensure that we have systems in place on how best to involve stakeholders meaningfully in the process. It also helps, maybe this will be my last point, to develop guidelines that are adaptable to national contexts and levels of development. The STDF GRP guide, for example, provides case studies and it has examples from developing countries. So it's a very actionable rather than theoretical document. So I think that's what my take on that question would be. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ndolo. This is all the time we have for this very interesting discussion. And on behalf of the entire team from the Ministry of Health and Social Welfare in Nigeria, the University of Missouri, and its assistance program based in Ghana, and the Food Agriculture Export Alliance, FADA, and NESG, who is helping facilitate, I would like to thank you for your time and for very generously sharing your experience.
Thank you.